So welcome. Thank you for having me tonight. This is a topic that I've talked about before, and it came up. It came up mostly because when I was working at Bay State Medical Center here in Springfield, Massachusetts, supervising the Department of Interpreting and Translation there, we had annual exams for our interpreters to make sure that they were keeping up with learning and keep abiding by the standards of practice for healthcare interpreters. And two of the standards that they most struggled with were role boundaries and impartiality. So it was always on my mind in terms of this is something that interpreters need more training, ongoing training aside from the basic training that they get when they first study it. And also the National Council on Interpreting in Healthcare, which has these two standards of practice in their standards of practice, they also did a survey and found that these were the ones that people struggled with the most, plus advocacy, which is a whole other can of worms and a great topic to present on as well. But tonight we're not going to get into that one. We're just going to get into impartiality and role boundaries. So this is, oh, and I have a clicker for the first time, and I don't know how to use it. Yeah, where am I going? Oh, it's the side one. Okay, it was probably just that. Thank you. This is just an overview of what I'm going to talk about today. So I'm just going to go over the roles very, very briefly. I expect that most of you watching tonight and here tonight know some of this, so this is kind of a quick review, and then really looking at what the standards say about impartiality, and then a little bit of strategies in terms of how to get better at abiding by that standard of impartiality, and then we're going to talk about role boundaries. And we might or might not have the mindfulness exercise. We'll see. So this image I really like in terms of talking about any kind of interpreting, really, but this is La Malinche. So many of you that have studied interpreting have probably heard of her before. She was an interpreter, and also she was an interpreter for Cortez in Mexico. She was in the Aztec part of Mexico, and she was a slave. She was traded in between different groups of people, and then finally ended up being given to Cortez as a slave, and then ended and served as his interpreter. And one of the things that I read was that almost all the images of him have her in it, and in some of the images she's actually larger than him. And she really became his main interpreter. She had learned Spanish along the way, and then several of the native languages. So he was able to do a lot of negotiating through her as the interpreter. She also had his first son. So the first known, or at least the first more famous mestizo, was the son of La Malinche, or Doña Marina, as she became known once she was baptized into the Catholic faith, and Cortez. And then later on moved on, and he moved on as well. But they didn't marry officially, as far as I know. But anyway, she was in this very interesting role. So she was his slave, she was his interpreter, and she also had a son with him. And there's just so many layers and levels that you can talk about her role. And she was in this position of helping him conquer Mexico, helping him negotiate for other slaves, for goods, for everything that was going on then. And at the same time, she held a lot of power, and she's represented as bigger than him in a lot of these figures, and he couldn't do a lot of this without her. So she's a controversial figure depending on where you are in Mexico and where you are in the world, and also time. Throughout time, it's changed a lot. Obviously, a lot of people saw her as somebody that betrayed them, and La Malinche, that expression, means somebody who betrays, especially in Mexico. So she's just this very controversial figure, and a good figure when we start talking about what is the role of the interpreter, and what are the role boundaries, and what does it mean to be impartial. Because think of what must have been going on with her. She's a slave herself, she's a captive to a certain extent, although they do seem to have held her in high regard while she was with him. And at the same time, she's negotiating and helping him take over her people and other Native people. And then what we had for a long time in interpreting studies, or even before it was really interpreting studies, but a lot of, most of people talking about interpreting and translation talked about visibility and being invisible. And I actually, there's an agency that I saw on Instagram, their account, and their tagline is actually making translation invisible. And I keep meaning to want to write to them. I was like, that's an interesting tagline, because nowadays that's not usually the goal, at least not in translation studies or interpreting studies. We no longer talk about the interpreter having to be invisible, or the interpreter should be invisible, because the fact is that there is no way to be invisible. The interpreter is always very present. The very presence of the interpreter changes the encounter. Yes, if you are a conference interpreter and you're in the back of the room in a booth and people are just hearing your voice, your presence is a lot less strong, and you're a little bit more invisible. Sometimes they actually do not see you at all, but they hear you, and the type of voice that you have, the type of interpreter, your delivery is going to make a difference on the impact for that person watching the lecture or the discussion. Anyway, but in medical interpreting, it's really impossible to be invisible. Again, even if you're on the phone, even if you're a video interpreter, you're there and you're changing that interaction between the provider and the patient. And that's how we talk about it in interpreting studies now. We no longer try to tell people that they should be invisible. And in terms of the standards of practice, they also know that. So the National Council on Interpreting in Healthcare, California Healthcare Interpreters Association, and the International Medical Interpreters Association, those three standards of practice, which are kind of the standard ones that are tested for in certification and that most training programs talk about and use to train interpreters, they recognize that in these standards, and they talk about the role of the interpreter. This is a broader picture that's taken from a very good textbook for community interpreting, which involves medical as a big part of community interpreting. And it's just in terms of situating where we are now. So before, we had La Malinche was one of the beginning, or the official beginning, at least it's on record. And now we have a whole other picture, right? So now we do have a profession. We've been working on this for many years. Certification is part of it, training is part of it. And I really just like this figure in terms of looking at, how to know who you are as an interpreter and what you should do. And so it's knowing why, and like who shapes the profession, knowing how, in terms of how you work. Then we look to the awareness of ethics, we look to the standards of practice. Knowing who the stakeholders are is important for interpreters, and then knowing what to do. So we're getting closer and closer to kind of like the core. And then at the very core is to know yourself as an interpreter. And this is especially important for the impartiality and the role boundary standards, but it really applies across the board for that. This probably all of you have seen by now. This is the classic pyramid that was done by Bridging the Gap originally, and all of us use it. I think it's due for an update, and there's been some discussion about updating it and changing it and kind of clarifying it to a certain extent. But these are seen as the 4 roles of the medical or healthcare interpreter, with conduit being the basic one, the pillar of them, the one that you're always doing, kind of the message in, message out model. And then recognizing that there's clarification that has to go on. And then it starts to get more and more interesting, right? And this model comes from the standards of practice. It's based on that. Then we have culture broker. So now we're recognizing that somebody's not interpreting just words. And not only is it not just words, but the meaning has to do with culture. And so as an interpreter, you do have to do some brokering of culture if you're going to transmit a message that's as full as possible as it can be between 2 people from a very different culture. And then we have at the top, which is to be used very rarely. You have to be very careful with it, usually done outside of the encounter. We have the role of an advocate. And this is one that also confuses people a lot. And I find that students kind of use that for everything. And so that's worth a lecture, Cristiano, and a future date, because it does get complicated, and I feel like people do overuse it a little bit. Okay. Now, with that said, these are as I was mentioning, these are the 3 organizations that have standards of practice that are recognized nationally by everyone to be extremely helpful and are good guides for when you're training interpreters or studying to be an interpreter. So the National Council on Interpreting in Healthcare is the one that I use the most when I train interpreters. IMIA has a very solid standards of practice as well. It's set up a little bit differently. It's much longer, and it's set up more in terms of questions and being able to test people by using it. It's not as easy to teach in that sense. And then the California Healthcare Interpreting Association has a really good ethical decision-making model that's really worth looking into as part of their standards of practice and code of ethics. So what do they say about impartiality? The National Council talks about impartiality. They link it to their ethical principle, remembering that the standards of practice are seen as guidelines to best practices, and also concrete examples linking how to apply ethics. And the code of ethics is something that kind of underlines a standard of practice. So the objective of it is to eliminate the effect of interpreter bias or preference. The interpreter does not allow personal judgments or cultural values to influence objectivity, and the interpreter discloses potential conflict of interest, withdrawing from assignments if necessary. And this is often a source of confusion for a lot of interpreters, as I mentioned. And what I hear a lot from people is a certain confusion with the notion of, well, let me continue. Let me go to the other 2, and then I'll talk about that. So then we have the California Healthcare Interpreting Association. They're going ahead and even being more practical with what they're saying. So interpreters are aware of the need to identify any potential or actual conflicts of interest, which we saw in the other one as well as any personal judgments, values, beliefs, or opinions that may lead to preferential behavior or bias affecting the quality and accuracy of the interpreting performance. And then the IMIA, as I said, the way they set it up, they don't have they don't have definitions and examples in the same way quite. And so they have 2, I'm not quite sure what to call them, 2 standards or 2 parts of the code that talk about this and that I pulled out. So manage internal conflict and maintain impartiality, because the manage internal conflict has to do with how to maintain impartiality. So that's why I pulled those 2 out to show. The confusion that I was getting to, that I find people have a lot with this idea of impartiality, is they talk about being neutral. And if you know me at all, you know I'm not one to, to get into semantics. I'm the one who says, if you call me a translator, even though I'm working as an interpreter today, that's really no big deal. You called me in, you called in a professional, you can call me a translator all you want. So I'm not usually one to really get into an argument over that. Obviously, internally, we speak about, we talk about ourselves in terms of what we do, but I don't find it to be so important. But I think with impartiality and neutrality, people get it confused. And it's an interesting way to kind of separate the 2 and resolve some of the problems with it. Because, and if you look at some of the definitions of neutrality, it's not taking a position or a side, it's indifference, and it's absence of decided views, expression, or strong emotions. And that's just not something that any of us are about everything, right? So, I'm a human being, I'm not invisible. I bring with me all of my story when I go to interpret, and I don't become neutral in the face of all these things when I'm interpreting. Whether for each person, it's a different thing that they are not going to feel neutral about, or that they're going to feel stronger about. And it runs the gamut from, bariatric surgery to seeking abortion services, to seeking vaccines or the use of Narcan, it just runs the gamut. And some people are going to be more or less impartial and more or less neutral to these things, but none of us are going to be neutral about everything. And I really don't think we should strive to be neutral about things. That's not the idea with impartiality. So in terms of when we think of, if you think back to what that definition is and what they talk about, it's, and the standards are very good in this regard. It's not letting your judgment, your opinions, your values, your beliefs affect the interpreting, affect the message, affect how the message is delivered. Um, so so by doing some work and starting to think of what is it that triggers me, what is it that creates an emotional reaction in me, because those are the things that I'm not neutral to. I have an opinion, I'm not indifferent. That can help you to identify them and then neutralize them in your delivery. So again, you're not being neutral in your opinion. You can have an opinion as strong as you want, but you don't want it to let you affect, you don't want it to affect them, how you're delivering the message. And of course, we talk about the fact that it could be body language, the look on your face, the tone of your voice when you deliver the message in that language. There's many different ways that you can betray the delivery of it. The other thing that you don't want it to affect, that you don't want your bias to affect, is the understanding of the message. So, and this is the part that gets really tricky, because you might not really know how much is affecting it. The idea is that if you think something is going one way and you're an interpreter and you're monitoring yourself, or you're taking notes and you're remembering because you're working in consecutive, and you're doing all this cognitive work, you have to be very careful not to let that filter how you're understanding the message to begin with. Because yes, most providers are there to help the patient get them better. If they're in a unit to get bariatric surgery, for example, the likelihood that they're going to tell them that they should do bariatric surgery is probably pretty high. But of course, there are going to be cases where they're telling them that it's not a good thing. And even just knowing that, having that background or your bias for or against it, you could mishear it, you could misinterpret it. So that's why it's so important to work on these, to try to make sure that they're not interfering. And we're not doing this isn't in a classroom, but really trying to think of to yourself, what are the kind of things that trigger an emotional reaction? So, an emotional reaction can be any of these things: anger, despair, disgust. We don't talk about that a lot, but really, in medical interpreting, sometimes things are really disgusting. And that's, that might not be bias, so to speak, but it's something that you're reacting to, and you might have an emotional reaction to it, and you need to remember how to act in that situation. The same thing with joy. It can overtake it, and if you're overjoyed by something that's happening as an interpreter, again, it could affect how you understand it. It could affect how you deliver it. In mental health, it's really important that you be aware of all this and listen very carefully to the mental health provider and how their delivery is. Because if you know anything about mental health, you know that providers talk to patients in very different ways, with very different tones and a voice and approaches, depending on the disorder or depending on that person or what's going on that day. And so you wouldn't want to make something sound more positive or more negative than the provider is doing. They're doing that for a very specific reason. And then fear and sadness are other things to kind of think about. Implicit bias is something that people talk about a lot. It's basically bias that a lot of times you're not even aware of. And it can be a lot more dangerous than explicit bias, because usually we're aware of those. So implicit bias is something that you're not quite aware of, and you often don't have control over it. This is something that when we talk about why you shouldn't use family members to interpret or friends to interpret, implicit bias is one of them. And their implicit bias could be one way or the other, for or against their mother, who knows, or for or against whatever the provider is recommending that their mother do. But the interpreter needs to be very careful not to have that as well. And here's just some details about implicit bias, how pervasive it is, how it's related to explicit bias, but it's not. They're not distinct. They are distinct mental constructs, rather. So they're different. It's a different thing going on. And a lot of times they don't align with what we say that we believe in. And it's hard work to think about that. It's because all of us want to be good people for the most part, and you know, it's very hard to realize that actually I have a really strong bias against something that I shouldn't have, or that as an interpreter, at least, I need to eliminate. Again, you can still have an opinion. You can still believe that it is really wrong for somebody to vaccinate their child. No problem. As an interpreter, you can believe that very, very strongly, but you have to make sure that when you're talking to the mother about vaccinating her children, as the provider is going to talk about, you don't let that come through in your voice. You don't let that come through in your face. You don't let it come through, well, certainly not afterwards, making some comment to the mother. But it's the kind of thing that I'm not saying you can't have an opinion about. Because what I see a lot with students too is this idea of like, well, if I have a conflict of interest because I don't agree with abortion, let's say, I just won't interpret in that situation. And I think in a lot of situations we have to be careful not to limit what we're doing and limit the services that others can have with a qualified professional interpreter because of the interpreter's bias that she or he hasn't worked on. So I think you can say that the first time and then go try to do some work so that you can overcome it. And we'll talk we're going to talk a little bit about one way of doing that, because there isn't just a constant supply of interpreters in all different flavors of liking one thing or another. And it's and I'm not saying that a belief that strong is just a like, but it's kind of an easy out to say, well, I won't interpret for that. And then, okay, well, I don't want to interpret for that either. Oh, okay, I shouldn't interpret for that either. The time that you should, in my mind, the time that you should say I have a conflict of interest and I can't interpret is when you know it's going to affect it. You know that today I'm going to go in there and I'm just not going to be able to do it. Either the message is going to get distorted, I'm going to understand it wrong, or maybe it's going to actually do me a lot of harm, because I've recently gone through something very similar to this person, and it's going to be opening up that trauma for me, and then I'm not going to do good work, or I'll be harmed so much that I should say it's a conflict of interest, or it's a family member, or I'm getting money from something else, or the classic conflict of interest. But that, I think it should be very limited. And I think once it happens in a situation, it's incumbent upon the interpreter to then seek to do more internal work. It's hard work to try to figure out, how can I work with patients that are making choices that I don't believe in, or work with providers that are making choices or doing surgeries that I don't believe in. Because this last bullet point is really important. The research shows that implicit biases are malleable, so they can be changed. When you look at neuroscience and the connections in our brain, those can be changed, because emotional trigger reaction to things is all about, as far as we know, it's all about the connections in the brain and their pathways that get kind of made in your brain. And yes, the more you do them, the more they're there and the more it's automatic, but you can undo that. Again, it takes a lot of work. Here's just some of a list of all the different things. And so it's not just the big things that we think of like race, but it could be body weight, or it could be education, just having a bias against people that have PhDs, or having a bias against people that don't, whether you own a car, or what kind of car you own, whether you're an introvert or an extrovert, who do you respect in the company? Is it somebody who's high up, or do you actually respect more the people that are lower in the hierarchy? So we're not doing this. I didn't mean to leave that slide in, sorry. So in terms of the emotional responses, and this is pretty classic psychology in terms of how we respond to something. There's either flight, right? So we run away, we want to avoid it. There's fight, where we we defend it, and then there's freeze. And when you're doing the work of eliminating implicit bias or any kind of emotional triggers, you'll see that those might be kind of those are going to be your 3 lines of defense, and it comes from nature. It's this idea of there's a predator, and an emotional response triggers in our brain this idea that something's attacking me, there's something wrong, and that, so that's why I'm either going to run away from that animal, or I'm going to attack that animal, or I'm just going to freeze. And if you look at certain nature videos, you'll see there's different animals that freeze, and those that attack, and those that run away. So I'm going to talk briefly about mindfulness and meditation. And this is something that is so helpful, I think, in so many realms. And it's particularly helpful for interpreters or for anyone that's dealing with emotional triggers and trying to work with those and not let them affect their life as much, professional and personal. The benefits of mindfulness are many. Some of them, in our case, are decreased emotional reactivity. So if you practice mindfulness, and it doesn't even have to be that regularly, your mind, you can, because what mindfulness does, and I'll give a more concrete example, because of it, you learn how to not react so quickly, so that either flight, fright, or freeze doesn't happen so quickly. Because it's all about recognizing what's happening right now and kind of stopping and not immediately reacting to it, and not by pushing it away. So if you think of meditation in the classic term of, somebody's sitting there and, they have their legs crossed in a lotus position and they're just thinking good thoughts, they're thinking happy thoughts. This is kind of like the stereotype of meditation. And you've tried it, because most of us at this point have been exposed to this at some point. And usually for most of us, it's like the first thing is like, I can't do this. I'm not doing it right. Oh, wow. So it feels so weird to have my eyes closed, and, is everybody else doing this? Do I look stupid? And you're fighting it, you're just, or if you get into it and then suddenly your mind starts wandering, most people try to fight that wandering. And so a good guided meditation or mindfulness exercise will tell you, just, recognize it, it's there, and then let it go. And a lot of that kind of training works in these situations, like recognize that you're upset by this provider, you're upset by this patient, by this situation, naming it, perhaps, just kind of pausing, this is why I'm upset, and then I'm going to now try to let it go, which is the hard one for the most part. It also increases your cognitive flexibility, because now you're not in the flight, fright, or freeze mode, so you can think better. And your brain, when you get into those 3 states, one of those 3 states, there's really nothing else going on in your brain. It's also the reason why people are quicker. They can run much quicker. They can get away because they're just focused on survival. So if you're not in survival mode, when something happens, when something triggers you emotionally, you can actually think your way out of it. And guess what? As an interpreter, you have to be thinking. There's no way to freeze. It also has been shown to improve your working memory and your focus. So studies that they did with people that were given mindfulness exercise and followed them, for example, and then did a cognitive task right after, the people that did the mindfulness exercise did a better job at the cognitive task than those that didn't. And then, vice versa, when they did it without the mindfulness beforehand, the same people didn't do as well. And it's been shown to reduce stress. And is it John Kabat-Zinn started the mindfulness-based stress reduction program at UMass Medical School in Worcester. It's a very good program. That's how I first became aware of mindfulness, because they had it at the hospital. They provided it to us at a very low cost. And it's amazing to see what people that go through a very short course can come out with. In terms of, let's see. Oh, and another thing, mindfulness has also been shown to reduce depressive symptoms in some people. And again, that emotional reactivity. While it increases the working memory, cognitive flexibility, and the speed of that you're processing information. So for our purposes, in addition to those other qualities of interpreting, but right now in terms of impartiality, it increases that awareness and acceptance of emotions, as I said. So emotions then don't become something that you need to push away. It's not, the idea is not that, oh, I should feel peaceful right now, I'm meditating. Oh, I should just feel calm, oh, my breath is really fast. It's a non-judgmental look at things. It's kind of mindfully looking and observing without trying to attach any judgment and without trying to attach too much thinking to it. And so a student, I presented at Smith yesterday, and a student was asking me, what do you do in a case where a medical provider isn't giving the patient enough information, and you feel that they really didn't talk about this as much as they should have? And I told her a lot of the times it's better really not to think about that, because if you come in with all this preconceived notion of what the provider should say or how the patient should react to what the provider says, it's much harder for you to interpret what is actually being said. And your role is to do that. Your role is to make sure that the relationship is between the provider and the patient, not you. You're there, you're not invisible, but you're not part of that core relationship of them seeking care and being given options for their care. And then you learn to differentiate between action, response, and consequence. So just wrapping up this part, it's, if we have that more of an internal awareness and acceptance of how we respond to the challenges, we can better control the outward expression of our reaction. And that decreases the impact on the message being communicated and the message being heard as well. Again, it's not about having bad opinions, bad feelings, and it's not about getting over it. It's not like, well, I really should be more accepting of X, Y, or Z. No, it's doing this more internal work so that you understand what triggers you, what you don't like, what makes you angry, what makes you sad, what makes you happy. And then if mindfulness is one way of doing it, where you can become aware of how you react to it, and then you're doing these exercises where you are constantly, your brain is going to try to react, your brain is going to tell you you're not doing it right, and you're just going to see that, and then you let it go. And then you just sit there for some more, and then another one comes and you see it. And there's a metaphor of a wave, like the waves come in and the waves go out. And you just observe that, like, that's what's going, wow, my heart is beating a lot faster now, but not adding any judgment, like, oh my God, that must be wrong. Because then when you're in a situation, if you do this stuff ahead of time, when you're in a situation that triggers you, you're going to be so much calmer, and you're going to be able to deal with it as an interpreter and as a person. So I don't think we're going to, due to time, we're not going to do this unless at the very end we have some time. So now let's talk about role boundaries. So I'm switching over, and I was thinking about this a little bit more today, and to me, the impartiality standard is kind of about your internal feelings. You're doing the internal work so that your delivery and your understanding isn't affected. Whereas role boundaries is kind of the external work. So role boundaries is how you define yourself vis-a-vis people asking you to do things. Most of the time. Sometimes you want to do it as well, but it's really the external front of things, right? So it's how do you separate yourself professionally from this person, from this group of people, in a way that's professional, in a way that doesn't ruin the relationship or the rapport, but that you don't have all the negative consequences of not having the role boundaries. And so the National Council talks about how you want to limit the interpreting role. So we're there to interpret, as complex as that is, and it's not just interpret, we're there to interpret, which is a very complex task. And we do that so that we can avoid conflicts of interest. So you limit your personal involvement with parties. You limit your professional activity to interpreting. You're not doing other services, which I think is what a lot of people want to do and do. And you also, if you're a dual role interpreter, then you stick to your role as an interpreter when you're dual role. So they're very specific in that. California Healthcare Interpreting Association talks about it as professionalism and integrity. So they don't have something called role boundaries, but this is what I've gleaned to be the same meaning, getting at the same point, which is you conduct yourself in a manner consistent with the professional standards and ethical principles of the healthcare interpreting profession. This is a very general statement. There's nothing wrong with that. I really like the National Council one because it gives you specific examples of what it means to be professional and ethical. And then the IMIA has a similar one where it's maintaining professional distance and maintaining professional integrity. Whereas if you know the National Council, they also have a standard of professionalism, which is where they talk about these other two things that the IMIA and that GE are doing. So if you know anything about this, the standards are all very similar. They're all agreeing on the same things. They just label them differently and talk about them a little bit differently. There's that lovely pyramid again. In terms of role boundaries, I mean, the most important thing that I've ever heard about, like the reason for them, came again from Marjorie Bancroft's cross-cultural communication textbook, the International Community Interpreter, and a couple of different versions of that, which is it's about autonomy. The respect code standard of practice is also about autonomy. So it's really, you want to help the patient, right? A lot of people get into medical interpreting because they want to help the patient. You have to be careful. The helping the patient is really just helping them communicate, helping the providers communicate with them. You're not there to help them with anything else. You're not there to be their guide to this new world, or or a guide out of their isolation as a limited English proficient person. You want to give them the autonomy for them to be their own person. Just help them with the language. And the example that they give in the textbook about autonomy is this idea of a bus driver. So the bus, you have a bus route, and the bus has a certain route it takes, and it stops at different times. And you have all these people getting on and off the bus that are depending on the schedule of the bus. They're depending that the bus is going to be there at a certain time, and all of that. And then you have somebody who's asking the bus driver to stop. Maybe there's a stop that's like 6 blocks away, and they broke their leg or something, and can you please stop in the middle of the stop? And the bus driver is like, well, I want to help them. I want to, what harm is it going to do? I'll stop the bus, where there's no bus stop, and it'll be fine. But in fact, if the bus driver did that for everybody that wanted a special stop, or kind of went a block out of the way, in the end, the whole function of the bus route and having a specific time that everyone else is relying on is not going to work. So you're making an exception for a couple of people because you want to help them, but then the whole system breaks down. And that's I think that's a really good analogy with interpreters over helping in really going over the role boundaries, doing things that interpreters shouldn't be doing because they want to help. And it's a great intention. It's wonderful to want to help. But there are whole professions in the medical field that do that. There's patient navigators, there's social workers, case workers, there's all kinds of different names and titles of people that can help the patient navigate things that are beyond communication. And the interpreter should point, and you all of course know this, they should point the patient in the right direction. So they don't stop the bus, but the bus driver could say, the number 36 stops there. Next time you could take number 36, for example. It also has to do with protection and really liability. So if you are, I'm just going to push the patient in the wheelchair a few steps, what's the harm? Just over to the next building. There's nobody here. They've asked me to do this. Something happens or something doesn't happen, but the patient later on feels a pain and feels like, anything goes on the record that the interpreter was pushing the patient around in the wheelchair. The interpreter is not trained for that. There's no compliance going on with the hospital for the interpreter to be pushing that wheelchair. So a lot of it is just protecting yourself from getting into situations like that. Yes, interpreters give rides to patients sometimes. Untrained interpreters that get caught up with a patient that really needs help from them and they don't know what else to do, and they're like, I know I really shouldn't do it, or maybe they don't even know they shouldn't do it, but I mean, that one is such a clear example. And I think it is in the National Council, I think actually gives that as an example, like you do not give rides, you know, such as giving rides to patients. The liability on that is enormous, but it really could be for smaller things too, because it starts small and then it gets bigger and bigger. And suddenly the nurse is like, well, I really don't have to be there because the interpreter's there, you know, so they're gonna take care of that. They're gonna make sure that that happens. And you don't want to do that. You want to have those rule boundaries really secure. So another really good recommendation from Marjorie Bancroft, and I'm not here to advertise her services or her textbooks, but I like to give credit where credit is due. And they talk about how to say no. And so this is a way to assert yourself, to make sure that you're abiding by those rule boundaries, because again, it is kind of an external thing that people are asking you to do, or you feel impelled to do. And they talk about this model where you don't start by saying no right away, because that triggers in that person an immediate reaction of like, well, I'm asking you to do something and you're saying no. So they're going to react immediately and, you know, get upset or be defensive or walk away because you're not helping them. So you don't start with that. You start with acknowledging, and they call it being gracious. You start with acknowledging the positive point that they're coming from. So try to find something in what they're asking you to do, as ridiculous as you think it might be, to why are they doing this, you know, and really put yourself in their shoes, and also think positively in terms of they're coming at this because they care, you know. It's not even enough to just say, well, they don't know any better. It's like, well, they think this is going to work, or they want the patient to get better. And so you're gracious about it. So you acknowledge again that they're coming at this for a really good reason. And you say, wow, that's, and I have an example on the next slide. Then you offer choices, and they say you have to offer at least 2 choices of an alternative, right? So the bus 36 comes here, and also, I don't have anything made up right now in my mind. Or if you take the train will come by here, something like that. And then at the end, you give the reason. So then at the end is when you say, you know, the standards of practice don't allow me to do that. I could lose my job if I did that, blah, 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 whatever your reasons are. So the request for a ride, and I call this an easy example because this is so obvious, and no trained interpreter would ever do it. But, you know, I really wish I could give you a ride home. So that's being gracious. It's like, I wish I could, I want to help you. I really wish I could. You know, I get that you know, you have your kids here, and it must be, you know, that's a really long ride on the bus. So you're kind of acknowledging that. Okay. Yes, that's good. That's right on time. And then you offer choices. So let's go back inside. You know, I think there's bus passes available, or maybe they can call somebody to pick you up. And then at the end you say, you know, I'm not allowed to drive clients in my car. You know, I would be personally liable. I could get in trouble. You know, I could even lose my job. So you're doing that all at the end. So now you've earned their trust. They feel, hopefully, that you sympathize with them, that you're with them. You're not just saying no, and you've offered them some choices. And this works wonders in any kind of situation, personal and professional. Just by listening and kind of seeing where that person's coming from does a lot. So that's the main technique for dealing with role boundaries. So really, as a way to sum up, just always remembering that the standards of practice are guidelines. You know, each situation is unique. That you're part of that bigger context that we looked at on one of those slides. It's not just about what you do this one time. You have to think of more, and I forget right now what the ethical model is, where it's like, it's only correct if you do it, if everybody else does it. I forget which one that is, but that's one way of thinking ethically about things. And I think it's really important. It's not just when you make a decision as an interpreter, it's not just you, it's the interpreter, and then it's the whole larger interpreting profession. So we want to be more and more consistent with that, so that providers and patients don't expect things from the next interpreter that aren't appropriate because the last one did it. And so that they continue to also fix the system. If there are things that patients need that interpreters can't deliver, then let's get those things for the patients. That's part of advocacy. And you can do that outside the encounter and talk to people at the hospital that can help you with that. And so you can, it's not that you can't make the system better. You can, but you're not going to make it better if you're doing them a favor this one time, stopping at the part that's not a bus stop, giving them a ride home. Whereas if you say, you know what, there's a constant problem. The people coming out of this rehab center have no way to get home. What can we do that as a hospital? And nowadays, you know, hospitals that are selling themselves, that could be an added service that they're now selling. Look how well we treat our patients. And they are much more patient-centered. And then really remembering that impartiality is crucial so that people have equal access. Because your values and your beliefs are not going to be the same as the providers or the patients. And you don't want to limit their access to a good interpreter like yourself at that point in time because of a bias that you have, that you're just kicking the can down the road and never trying to solve and never trying to get over, again, as your reaction to it, not how you feel about it. And I think with that, we can take some questions.